The human body has two communication systems. One is the nervous system, which functions through neurons that go directly to a location, releasing a chemical signal to cause its action. The other one is the endocrine system, which functions similar but a little bit different. So the endocrine system is going to release its chemical signal to the entire body throughout the blood. And then that signal is going to float around until it gets to a target cell that has a specific receptor on it. So all hormones function through activating a cell's actions through a specific receptor. So that receptor and that hormone have to fit together. It's kind of like a lock and a key. These hormones are released by different glands throughout the body. Glands like the thyroid gland, the pancreas, even fat tissue or heart tissue release hormones. So there's lots of glands or tissues that can function like glands and release hormones in the body. Once the hormone bumps into its receptor and binds to it, it can cause actions related to that hormone. Hormones do all kinds of things in our body. They regulate our metabolism, they regulate our blood pressure, our fluid levels in our body, so how much blood do we have in our body, electrolyte balance. It also regulates protein synthesis for protein growth, so that when your muscles are getting larger, or for protein repair. So the hormones are extremely important for our body's normal function. There are two primary categories of hormones in our body. We have the steroidal hormones that are essentially made up of lipids, kind of like a fat, and we have the non-steroidal hormones that are made up of either a protein or an amino acid. And we have a third classification that is a pseudo-hormone, which are prostaglandins, and I'll talk about that in a second. Steroid hormones, a couple examples, all the sex hormones, so testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, those are all steroid hormones. So is cortisol, the stress hormone that we all know. Non-steroidal hormones, those are things like glucagon that control glucose release into the blood, insulin, growth hormone, thyroxine, which controls metabolism, and melatonin, which has actions in our sleep cycle. Prostaglandins, those pseudo-hormones I mentioned earlier, they aren't real hormones because although they get released from one cell and taken up by another cell, they don't usually float around the body. They go from one cell to maybe a neighboring cell, and then they do their action. Most prostaglandins have some sort of function in, say, immune response. So a cell gets damaged in some way, it releases prostaglandins, and another cell nearby picks it up and causes some sort of action. So these are typically derived from arachidonic acid, and an example of this is cyclooxygenase, which is the prostaglandin that the drug ibuprofen works on. The prostaglandins are super important for things like swelling after an injury or some sort of infection. So let's back up now and talk about the differences between the two major types, again, the steroidal hormone and the non-steroidal hormone. So now let's talk about steroid hormones. So these are lipid-based molecules or lipid-based hormones that are not able to float around the blood on their own, because blood is mostly water and lipids and water, so think of oil and water, how they don't mix. Same thing goes here. So when a steroid-based hormone is trying to get around the blood, it's going to bind to a carrier protein that allows it to stay in solution within the blood. This is how it gets around the blood and avoiding separating out, again, the way oil and water separate from one another. Once the steroid hormone gets to the cell, it's going to go through the membrane easily, because while the hormone is made out of lipids, so is the membrane. Because remember, all cells in the body have a bilayer lipid membrane. So it goes right through that membrane without any problem. And inside the cell, it's going to bind to its receptor type. Whether it's near the nucleus or in the nucleus, it's usually somewhere in that area. So the hormone is going to come in, it's going to interact with the DNA. That DNA is then going to release an mRNA, which is going to go out of the nucleus and react with or interact with a ribosome, where it's going to create a protein that hormone was trying to create. So essentially think of this like creating new machinery inside the cell. So with steroid hormones, it's going to create new machinery inside the cell, so you can do new things or more of the same things inside that cell. Non-steroid hormones act a little bit differently. So these are protein or amino acid based, remember. And that means they don't have an issue getting around the blood, so they don't need an extra carrier protein. It can get around the blood just fine on its own. However, this hormone, once it gets through the blood, its receptor needs to be on the membrane of the cell, because these hormones cannot go through the membranes of the cell. Because again, that membrane is a lipid layer, and so only other lipid type molecules can go through it. So these being protein based or amino acid based cannot go through it. So it binds to its receptor on the membrane, which activates a secondary messenger, this little blue symbol here, which then goes to some site within the cell and causes its action. Usually there's some cascading that happens where multiple things are activated, and it kind of spreads and amplifies the signal as well. So where the steroidal hormones created new machinery inside the cell because it created new proteins, non-steroidal hormones don't usually interact with the DNA to create new proteins, but they increase or decrease the action of the proteins that are already there, and that's how they function. So now that we've covered how hormones interact with cells in the body to either increase the protein levels or change the function of the proteins within the cell, now let's talk about how we control hormone release. So most hormones in the body are controlled through what's called negative feedback, which means essentially if you increase the level of the hormone, you're going to have more of that hormone floating through the body, creating some sort of action. And then that action feeds back on the system, telling it that there's too much of the hormone, and then it tells it to decrease the level of the hormone that's being released. And so you get what essentially looks like a cyclic pattern, where it's kind of going up and down, and that's what's being displayed here, this up and down of the hormone's too low, then the hormone's too high, then the hormone's too low, and the hormone's too high. That's how all negative feedback loops work. It's very similar to how a temperature-controlled house, how its thermostat works. So when the temperature gets too low, it brings the temperature up. When the temperature gets too high, it brings the temperature back down. So it feeds back on itself. Some hormones do function through positive feedback, meaning as you release the hormone, it feeds back on itself, telling it that same gland to release even more and even more and even more, and so you end up with this amplification of the hormone signal. This isn't very common, but there are situations like with childbirth where you're releasing hormones and the contractions cause more of those hormones to be released, and it's this amplification that happens which allows you to eventually give birth to your child. So there are hormones that don't work through this negative feedback, but most hormones do use negative feedback loops. So when trying to determine how much a hormone signal is being received by the body or released into the body, what people do essentially is they measure the concentration of the hormone in the blood. However, that doesn't give us the whole story, because hormone receptors are the other part of that. Remember, just having the hormone doesn't give you the response you need. You need the hormone and its receptor that fits with that hormone in order to get any action. So we have both downregulation and upregulation that can take place. So what we have here is an example of a low hormone, low receptor situation where you're going to have a very small response of that hormone. Then you can have a high hormone concentration but a very low receptor concentration, which is what we show in this upper right quadrant here. You're still going to have a fairly low, maybe slightly greater, but still a fairly low response to the hormone, because you just don't have the receptors there to take up that hormone. Then if you come down here, we have a lot of hormone receptors and not much hormone. So again, a fairly small to moderate response. And then we have over here in this bottom right-hand quadrant, a high response that's going to be taking place because we have both a lot of hormone and a lot of the receptors. So the downregulation of receptors, which is what would be shown here where there's only a couple of receptors, or the upregulation of receptors, also has an impact. So both the number of receptors that are available and the amount of hormone that is being released into the system are important. So receptors can downregulate or upregulate over a period of usually days to weeks, maybe months, and they do so whenever there's too much or too little of something floating around the blood. So let's talk about some specific hormones that have action in the body when we exercise. So when we start to exercise, you're going to have you're going to have a quick bump in blood glucose and then a slow decline over time. So blood glucose is one of the fuel sources that our muscles use in order to maintain exercise intensity. And so we also have this decrease in muscle glycogen that's going to occur over time. So glycogen, whether it's in the muscle or the liver, is the storage form of glucose. So we have all this muscle glycogen that is going to be slowly sort of used up throughout the exercise bout, and we have blood glucose that kind of goes up and then slowly also gets used up throughout the exercise bout. And we have this glucagon response here. So glucagon, what it does is cause release of the liver glycogen stores. So the liver and the muscles are the two primary sources for stored glycogen. The muscle glycogen is going to be used directly by the muscle that it's inside of, where the liver glycogen gets released from the liver, turns into blood glucose, and then is able to enter the muscle and act in the muscle and be a source of fuel for that muscle. And the insulin's job is to activate what's called GLUT4. So it's a glucose uptake transporter inside of the cells of our body. Its job is to come to the surface of the cell, grab glucose, and bring it inside the cell. So when you're releasing insulin into the body, that's what it's doing. It's activating these GLUT4 receptor types that are coming to the surface, grabbing onto the glucose floating around the blood and bringing it into the cell. Counter to what you would think would happen, insulin actually decreases with exercise. As exercise goes on, it goes lower and lower and lower. If our muscles are able to uptake glucose, so in other words, take that glucose inside of itself using GLUT4, which requires insulin, how does this continue to happen with exercise even though the insulin levels are dropping with exercise? So one of two ways. One is the GLUT4 transporters can become more sensitive to the insulin that is there, which does happen with exercise. So during the exercise bout, they become more sensitive. And this is also one of the reasons why exercise is good for diabetics, because it can increase insulin sensitivity over time. And the other way is muscle contraction itself has the ability to activate GLUT4. So when the muscles contract, it activates these GLUT4 transporters. They go to the surface of the cell and act the same way they would have if they were activated by insulin, so they start to bring in the glucose. So even though we have this drop in insulin during exercise, we're still able to get the glucose we need into the active tissue. And this is actually a good thing, because if there's insulin floating around the blood in high quantities, all the tissues of the body would be taking in this glucose, not just the skeletal muscle, all of the tissues. So when you have a decrease in this insulin, you have a decrease in glucose uptake by less active tissues. They aren't bringing in the glucose, which is allowing this bump in glucose to take place. And then the active skeletal muscle that is able to activate its own GLUT4 receptors without the need for insulin, it's going to increase its activity because of the contraction. So there's more glucose floating around the blood for it to bring in. So it's this interaction between decreasing how much glucose is going to other tissues because they don't need all that glucose, they're not being highly active at the moment, and the glucose is then floating around the system, going to the muscles where they're able to suck it in without the need for insulin. All right, some other hormones here. So we have epinephrine and norepinephrine that are really neurotransmitters that are released from the sympathetic nervous system. When these neurons are releasing norepinephrine and epinephrine, it's releasing it in very high quantities a lot of the time. And some of that gets leaked into the bloodstream. That epinephrine and that norepinephrine that gets leaked into the bloodstream becomes hormones then, because it's floating around the blood and able to interact with tissues and cells that weren't necessarily the immediate target of those neurons that originally released them. And so going around the bloodstream, they can have effects very similar to what they would have been if these neurotransmitters were released directly onto the cells. So you're going to see an increase in heart rates throughout an exercise bout with progressive increases in exercise intensity. We're also going to have a progressive increase in stroke volume to a certain point, usually around 60% of maximal exercise intensity, and then it kind of levels off. And you also have an increase in systolic blood pressure throughout progressive increases in exercise. and diastolic blood pressure, at least with aerobic exercise, usually stays about the same. And so you have mean arterial pressure, which is just a calculation between diastolic and systolic blood pressure that just kind of stays somewhere in between, goes up slightly as well. So another hormonal response that's very important that takes place during exercise is how we maintain blood volume during exercise. So we have two hormones that are going to be released when plasma volume starts to drop. So plasma volume drops whenever we sweat. Sweat is essentially blood, the liquid portion of blood coming out of your skin and cooling you off. And so if you're taking it out of the blood, that means plasma volume, so the blood volume itself is dropping, and that's going to be sensed by cells that are very sensitive to this, specifically in the kidney. And so plasma volume starts to drop, and what starts to happen is you release renin into the system, which is a hormone that eventually causes the release of antidiuretic hormone, which is shown here, and aldosterone, which is also shown here. So plasma volume comes down, and both antidiuretic hormone, or ADH, goes up, and aldosterone goes up. So this is good because antidiuretic hormone, like it sounds, its job is to prevent you from losing lots of liquid. So diuretic meaning to lose liquid, so it's antidiuretic, so it maintains the liquid in your blood. So antidiuretic hormone goes up, which is going to increase how much water is being reabsorbed within the kidney, and it prevents you from losing a lot of fluid volume. Aldosterone, on the other hand, it's going to act to prevent you from losing too much sodium. So it's going to prevent you from losing too many electrolytes, essentially. So as you're releasing the aldosterone, you're decreasing the amount of electrolytes being lost in both urine and sweat, and that eventually is going to cause more fluid to be retained by the body as well, because typically water will follow the sodium. So if you're keeping sodium in the blood, water is going to stay in the blood as well. So both of these mechanisms act to prevent you from becoming dehydrated too quickly and to keep blood volumes high so that you can function normally during exercise. So when you start to exercise, as we've already discussed, some hormones are going to be increasing their action. They're going to be released in higher quantities. And those hormones are all listed here, at least some of the big ones are. So you're going to get an increase in norepinephrine release and epinephrine release, again from the sympathetic nervous system, but it floats around the blood like a hormone. You're also going to get an increase in glucagon being released, which is going to increase the amount of glucose floating around the blood. And you're going to get a decrease in insulin being released, which also is going to increase the amount of glucose floating around the blood because it's going to decrease how much glucose is being taken up by the less active tissue. And you are going to have an increase in the cell sensitivity to insulin. So this is not a hormone, but this is another function that's going to increase. Same with GLUT4, the intracellular glucose transporter that brings that glucose from the outside of the cell into the cell. It's going to increase its activation, or it's going to increase its action during exercise too. If you exercise for long enough, so at least 15 minutes typically, you're going to have an increase in cortisol release, which is a stress hormone. And if you're exercising for even longer, so usually 25 or 30 minutes to an hour or so, you're going to have release of aldosterone and ADH, that antidiuretic hormone we just talked about. So most of these hormones are going to have some action that is going to affect metabolism. So it's going to increase the glycolysis rate, which is how we break down glucose and turn it into energy. And it's going to also have effects on the blood pressure, heart rate, and stroke volume, so the cardiovascular system. It's going to decrease how much sodium and water we're losing to maintain blood volume. So all these are active during exercise and having effects that should promote the level of exercise that's the body's capable of doing. After exercise, these hormones start to go back to normal, but other hormones are going to increase. So you're in the 30 to 45 minutes post-exercise, you're going to have still a large norepinephrine and epinephrine release into the bloodstream, which is going to increase lipolysis, and it's going to help to decrease the strain on our glucose stores. So we're increasing lipolysis, which is the breakdown of fat to create energy. so that we can spare some of the glucose that's in our system. We're also going to still have cortisol being released in high quantities, which is that stress hormone. It helps the body sort of just function at a higher level here. It has lots of effects. And we're going to have now an increase in both growth hormone and testosterone being released in the system, both of which are going to act to increase lipolysis, which is, again, that fat breakdown. And these two, the growth hormone and testosterone, are also going to start to work on tissue repair, so rebuilding the proteins that were broken down in the muscle cells. If you wait a little longer, so this was 30 to 45 minutes, if you wait to about 80 minutes, so an hour and 20 minutes essentially, you're still going to have high levels of growth hormone and testosterone being released. And at this point, yes, it's still going to increase lipolysis, but it's going to primarily be trying to repair the tissues that were damaged, so repairing that muscle tissue that was broken down during the bout of exercise. So I hope this was helpful. This is a very, very brief overview of how hormones work.